I have buried 4 men in frozen ground, and I will tell you the truth that the burying taught me. A hole in the earth can mean a grave, or it can mean a home, and most of us never learn the difference until the cold comes to teach it. When I was younger, I laughed at a man for digging into a hillside. I laughed with the whole valley, because laughing together is warmer than thinking alone. We called him names I am ashamed to write now. We said he was burrowing like an animal, that he'd lost whatever sense the Lord or his own people had given him. We said a lot of things, the way men do when they are comfortable and have not yet been afraid. Then the winter came that took the breath out of the territory. The winter the old-timers still won't speak about without dropping their voices. And one by one, the proud men with their proud square cabins began to freeze inside their own 4 walls, and the man we had laughed at walked out of his hill, warm, blinking in the white light, and looked at us with eyes I have never been able to forget. This is the story of that man and that hill, and the choice he made on the worst night any of us ever lived through. I have carried it 40 years. I am tired of carrying it alone. So sit close, bank the fire if you've got one, and let me tell you about the tunnel everyone doubted and what the deadly winter did to the rest of us. The screaming started a little after midnight, and I knew before I was even awake that it was the Prout girl. I'd know that sound anywhere, thin and high and breaking at the edges, the way a child screams when the thing frightening her is not a wolf or a dream but a grown person's fear, caught and passed down like a cold. I sat up in my bunk with my heart going like a hammer on a fence post, and the first thing I felt was not pity. I want to be honest, because if I dress this up you won't believe the rest. The first thing I felt was the cold. It came through the chinking of my cabin like water through a sieve. It came up through the floorboards and down from the rafters, and it met somewhere around my chest and squeezed. My breath hung in the air over my bunk, a pale gray ghost lit by the last orange coals in the stove, and I watched it hang there and I thought, with the strange flat calm a man gets at the worst moments, I have never in my life seen my own breath inside my own house. That was the night I understood what was coming for us. I should tell you my name, since I'll be asking you to trust me for a while. They called me a saboon. I ran 200 head and a bad knee on a stretch of grass and rock east of the Pinolinos, and I had run them there for 11 years by that winter, ever since I'd put my wife Elsa in the ground under the cottonwood, and decided I didn't have anywhere else worth going. I kept a logbook out of habit she'd started in me. She said a man who writes down his days can't lie to himself about them later. I still keep it. I am writing this out of it now, copying my own bad hand, and where the ink shakes you'll know it's the parts I'd rather skip. I had a quirk she used to tease me for, when I'm afraid I count. Fence posts, cattle, the buttons on a man's coat, anything. There was one button in particular, a little brass one off Elsa's traveling coat, that I kept in my left pocket and rolled between my fingers when the counting wasn't enough. I had it in my hand that midnight, rolling it, listening to the Prout girl scream across the dark, and I counted my own breaths to keep from running outside half-dressed into a cold that would have killed me before I reached her. Let me tell you about the man this story is really about, because by the time the screaming started, I already owed him more than I'd ever admitted. We called him Mountain Joe. That was not his name. I want that on the record before anything else because the carelessness of it shames me now. His name was a thing I heard him say once, slow and patient, the way you'd speak to a child or a fool, and I could not hold it. It moved in my mouth like water and ran out the sides. Goes up the hard way, the trader Salomon told me it meant, more or less, though Salomon was the kind of man who'd tell you a thing meant whatever made the better story. The Apache who came down to trade called him by the real name, and dropped their voices a little when they did, the way you do for a man who has earned something you can't quite see. We called him Mountain Joe because it was easy, and because calling a man something easy is a way of making him smaller, and we wanted him small. He had come to the valley maybe 3 years before that winter, one of the ones who hadn't gone where the soldiers wanted the people to go, who'd slipped the net somehow and just stayed, quiet, on a piece of broken ground nobody else wanted because you couldn't run cattle on it and you couldn't plow it. It was a north-facing slope of red dirt and rock, steep, scrubbed with juniper and a few mean little oaks, and there was a spring at the bottom of it that ran sweet even in August. That spring was the only thing of value, and we'd all decided at one time or another that we'd take it off him eventually. We just hadn't gotten around to it. There's a kind of theft that waits, polite, for a better excuse. The first I ever saw of his digging, I thought he was making a grave. It was a fall morning, frost still silvering the grass, and I'd ridden up that way looking for a heifer that had gone through a gap in my fence. I came over the rise and there he was, halfway up his ugly red hill, throwing dirt out of a hole with a kind of patience that didn't look like a man in any hurry at all. He had no shirt on despite the cold. His back was wet and shining, and the muscles of it moved like something under the surface of a river. He didn't look up at me. He had a way of not looking at you that wasn't rudeness. It was more like he'd already seen everything about you he needed to, and was being kind enough not to make you stand there while he confirmed it. "You lose somebody, Joe," I called down. I meant it as a joke. I want you to understand the kind of man I was then. I rode up on a man digging in the cold by himself, and the first thing out of my mouth was a joke about a grave. He kept digging. Then, after a while, when I'd already turned my horse to go, he said, not loud, but it carried, "Not yet." I laughed about that for a week. I told it at Hagen's store, and I told it at the Prout's table, and everybody laughed, "Not yet," like it was the funniest thing, like the man was simple. Old Joe's digging his own grave up there, says he's not ready yet. And the more we laughed, the bigger the hole got, week over week, and the bigger the hole got, the harder we laughed. Because a man will defend a joke long past the point where it's funny if the alternative is admitting he never understood it. It wasn't a grave. By the first hard frost it was a doorway. He'd gone into the hill, not down, in. He'd cut a passage back into the slope, low and narrow at the mouth so you had to duck, and the doorway faced a little south of east so the low winter sun could reach down the throat of it. I didn't understand any of that then. I understood it the way you understand a foreign language being spoken fast, that there were rules to it, that it wasn't random, that the man knew exactly what he was doing even though I couldn't have said what that was. He shored the passage with juniper trunks, fitted so tight you couldn't have slid a knife between them. Behind that, where the hill swallowed the light, he'd opened up a room. I only saw the inside of it twice before the winter, and the first time I saw it I felt something I didn't have a word for and was too proud to look for one. It was warm. Not warm like a stove, warmer than that and stranger. It was the deep, even breathing warmth of a thing that has its own heat and isn't fighting the cold so much as ignoring it. The walls were earth, packed and smoothed, and they did not sweat and they did not chill. He'd built a little fire pit near the mouth with a clever draw to it that pulled the smoke up and out through a chimney shaft he'd dug at an angle, so the room itself stayed clear. But here's the thing I came to understand only later, lying awake in my own freezing cabin doing my counting. The fire wasn't making the warmth. The hill was. The fire just woke it up. All that earth around him, tons of it, held the heat of the day and the heat of every small fire he'd ever burned in there, and it gave it back slow, like a good animal sharing its body. My cabin was made of sawn lumber I'd hauled 40 miles and was prouder of than I had any right to be. Square corners, a real glass window, a peaked roof I'd shingled myself with my own torn-up hands, and it could not hold heat the way that hole in the dirt held heat, and somewhere in me, even then, even laughing, I knew it. I think that's why I laughed the hardest. You always laugh hardest at the man who's quietly proving you wrong. There was a girl up there with him sometimes. His granddaughter I came to understand, though the understanding came in pieces and I'm not sure I ever had all of them. She was maybe 9 or 10 that winter, with a face like a closed door and quick black eyes that missed nothing. She didn't speak our language and we didn't try to speak hers. She'd watch us when we rode by, watch us laugh, and her face wouldn't change, and I used to find that unsettling without knowing why. I know why now. She'd already learned the thing we hadn't, That the people laughing at you in good weather are not the people you can count on when the weather turns. She was just waiting to see how bad it would get before she found out what we really were. Now the winter. I have lived a long time and seen a lot of weather, and I'm telling you there has never been anything like it before or since. It came down out of the north in the last week of what should have been a mild autumn, and it just stopped. The cold stopped, I mean. It came down and stood on us and would not move. Day after day the sky was that hard, cloudless, pitiless blue, and the sun came up looking like a coin somebody had thrown away, giving light but no heat, and every night the temperature fell into a place none of us had instruments to measure or words to describe. Salomon had a thermometer at the store, and one morning it read 40 below, and then the next morning it had cracked, the column broken, and after that we just stopped looking. There's a point past which knowing the number doesn't help you. The creeks froze solid, ground to bottom. The cattle started dying first, of course. You'd find them standing up, dead on their feet, frozen where they'd stood, ice in their open eyes. I lost 160 head in 9 days. I am ashamed to say I wept more for them than I had for some people. But a man's livelihood is a kind of family, and I watched mine die in the cold and could do nothing. And then it started killing people. The Hoggins went first, out at the far end of the valley. Nobody knew for 4 days. When Prude and I finally broke through their door, the latch had frozen. We found them all in the one bed, the 4 of them, the parents and the 2 little boys, and they had piled every blanket and every coat and every stitch of clothing they owned on top of themselves, and it had not been enough. Their fine square cabin with its good tight corners had turned into an icebox around them. Old Hagen had his arm over the smaller boy. I will not write what their faces looked like. I close my eyes and I see it still, and I have made my peace with the fact that I always will. That was when the laughing stopped in the valley. All of it, all at once. You could feel it stop, like a sound you didn't know you were hearing until it quit. We started doubling up after the Hoggins. Folks moved in together, 2 and 3 families to a cabin, burning furniture, burning fence rails, burning anything that would catch. My nearest neighbors, the Prutes, Carl and his wife Marta, and the 2 girls, the little one being the one who'd scream me awake that midnight, they came to me, or I went to them. I honestly can't remember which way the desperation flowed first. We were 8 or 9 people crowded into my proud sawn lumber cabin, burning my proud peaked roof a board at a time. And on the 4th night I lay there with my breath hanging over me and the cold squeezing my chest, and I knew, the way you know a true thing all at once and forever, that my house was going to kill us the way Hagen's house had killed his. And I thought about the hill. I lay there and I thought about the man we'd called Mountain Joe, warm in his hole in the ground, and I rolled Elsa's brass button between my fingers in the dark, and I counted the people breathing around me, the boards left to burn, the hours until a dawn that wouldn't help, and I did the arithmetic that I think every soul in that valley was doing in their own freezing dark that week. He's warm up there. We laughed at him, and he's warm, and we are dying, and he knows it. Here is the part I have never told anyone. Here is the part the ink shakes on. I did not want to go to him. It wasn't only pride, though it was that too. It was that I knew what we were. I knew what we'd done, the names, the laughing, the polite plan to take his spring when it suited us. I knew that if I climbed that hill and knocked on the juniper door and asked that man to save the lives of the people who'd spent 3 years making him small, I would be asking him to be better than we had ever once been to him. And some cowardly accountant in my heart kept whispering that maybe it was kinder, cleaner, more dignified to just freeze in my own bed than to live by the mercy of a man I'd wronged. That accountant was still whispering when the Prute girl started screaming. I came up out of the bunk and grabbed for my coat, and the cold hit me so hard it was like walking into a wall. Marta was already up, was already across the room, was already gathering the child against her, and over the screaming I heard Carl Prute say a thing I've never forgotten. Carl, who had laughed louder than any of us, who had been the one to first say Mountain Joe and make it stick, who had taken the man's measure as a fool and never once revised it. He said very quietly in the dark, not to me and not to God, but just out into the freezing room, "We have to go to the hill." And nobody argued. That's the thing. Nobody said a word against it. All our laughing, all our certainty, all 3 years of it, and it took one screaming child and 4 nights of cold to burn it down to nothing, to bring us to this. A room full of proud people sitting in the dark, agreeing without a single word of debate that our only hope was the man we had ruined. But it was the middle of the night, and it was 40 below or colder, and the hill was the better part of 2 miles off, uphill, through country that would kill an unprepared man between one fence post and the next. And there were children among us, and an old woman, Marta's mother, who could not walk 100 yards on a summer day. To go now in the dark was to die on the way. To wait for the light was to maybe not have enough of us left to make the going worth it. I stood there in my coat with my breath freezing on my collar and the child still crying, and every face in that room turned to me, because it was my house, and a man's house makes him the one they look at, fair or not, and I understood that the choice had come down to me, the real choice, the one underneath all the others. Not whether to throw ourselves on the mercy of the man we'd wronged. How many of us to risk to find out if he had any. I rolled the button between my fingers until I thought I'd wear it smooth, and I counted the faces in the firelight, and the firelight was very low. I want to walk you slow through how we came to that number, because the number itself was a kind of confession, and I've spent 40 years deciding whether it was the right one. To this day, I don't know. I only know it was mine. 9 of us in that cabin, and the cold deciding the math whether we liked it or not. We couldn't move everyone through that dark. The old woman, Marta's mother, couldn't be moved at all. The 2 children couldn't survive 2 uphill miles at 40 below. And a man burns through his strength fast in cold like that, the body spending itself just to stay alive, so that even the strong among us were not as strong as we'd have been in June. We had no horses worth the name left. The 2 that hadn't died were standing in the linta with frost in their lungs, blowing red, and I knew if I rode one up that hill I'd be killing it and likely myself. So 3 would go on foot. 3 would go and find out whether the man on the hill had any mercy left for us, and if he did, the 3 would come back with whatever help he'd give, and we'd move the others in shifts, fast, before the cold could take them. And if he didn't, if he stood in his juniper doorway and looked at us with those eyes that had already taken our measure 3 years ago and found it wanting, well, then 3 of us would die on his hill instead of 9 in my cabin, and at least the dying would be honest. Carl Prout said he'd go. I'd expected that. A man who's been the loudest fool has the most to burn off, and Carl had been burning ever since we carried the Hagen boys out into the white. He didn't say much. He just started wrapping his hands in strips of Marta's good wool dress, which she'd torn up without a word and handed him, and the 2 of them not looking at each other while she did it, because some kinds of love can't survive being looked at directly in a moment like that. I said I'd go, my house. My number, my arithmetic. I wasn't going to send men to find out the size of a mercy. I was too proud to test myself. The 3rd was the traitor, Salaman. Salaman had washed up in my cabin 2 nights before, half frozen, having abandoned his store when the stove couldn't keep the front room above killing cold. He was a soft man, a town man, with a belly and a way of talking that filled silences other people would have left alone. But he had one thing none of us had. He knew a little of the language. He'd traded with the people for years, cheated them when he could and dealt square when he couldn't get away with it. And somewhere in all that dealing, he'd picked up enough words to maybe make our case where the rest of us could only stand there with our hats in our hands looking like exactly what we were. So Carl, who had wronged the man worst, me whose house it was, Salaman who could speak, 3. We left the others banked around the dying stove, burning the last of my peaked roof, and we went out into the dark. I have tried many times to describe that cold to people who weren't in it, and I have always failed. So I'll just tell you the small things, because the small things are all a man can really hold. The snow squeaked. Not crunched, squeaked. A high dry sound under our wrapped feet. The sound snow only makes when it's far too cold to pack, when it's gone to powder and sand. The air had a smell to it, or rather it took your smell away, scoured the inside of your nose clean, and then started in on the meat of you. And within 100 yards I couldn't feel my face, and within 200 I'd stopped trying. The stars were so many and so hard and so close that they didn't look beautiful. They looked hostile, like the eyes of something enormous and patient that had been waiting a long time for us to come outside. I counted. Of course I counted. I counted our footsteps in lots of 100, and when I lost the count I started over, and the starting over was its own small mercy, a thing to do with the part of my mind that wanted to lie down. I had Elsa's button in my fist inside my mitten, and I'd worked my thumb raw against it before we were halfway. Carl walked ahead, breaking trail, his breath a frozen beard already crusting white on the wool over his mouth. Salomon walked behind, talking, God help him, still talking, low and ragged, because I think the talking was the only thing keeping his soft town heart from quitting. He talked about his mother's kitchen in a city I'd never heard of. He talked about a woman he'd meant to marry and hadn't. I didn't answer, and Carl didn't answer, and Salomon didn't need us to. He was just laying down a thread of human noise to follow through the dark. About a mile in, Carl went down. He didn't stumble. He just folded. One moment breaking trail, the next a dark heap in the squeaking snow, and the silence where his footsteps had been was the loudest thing I'd heard all night. Salomon and I got to him and hauled him up, and he was talking. Thank God, slurring but talking, saying he was fine, saying he just needed a minute. And Salomon and I looked at each other over the top of his frozen head, and we both knew there were no minutes out here. A minute out here was a grave. We got an arm of his over each of our shoulders, and we walked him, half-dragged him, his wrapped feet plowing furrows, and he kept saying he was fine, and we kept lying that we knew he was, and the hill came up out of the dark ahead of us at last, blacker than the black around it, with one small orange eye burning partway up its face. A light in the doorway of the hill. He was awake. He was in there, warm, and he had a fire lit, and the light of it reached out the throat of that passage and lay a long, faint orange tongue on the snow. I have thought a great deal in 40 years about what it cost us to climb that last slope toward that light. Not the cold was just trying to kill our bodies, and that's a simple thing, a clean fight. It was the light that was hard, because every step toward it was a step deeper into the truth of what we were. 3 men who had ruined a man for sport now crawling up his hill to beg, dragging a fourth who'd given him his name. There is a particular shame that is weight, that you carry in the actual muscles of your legs, and I carried it up that hill, and it was heavier than Carl. We came to the doorway, we had to stoop, and he was there. He was sitting just inside, beyond the little fire, and he had been sitting there a while. I understood that all at once, and it went through me colder than the night. He'd been waiting. He had seen us coming, 3 dark specks crawling up the white, and he had not come out to meet us, and he had not barred the door. He had simply sat down where we'd be able to see him, and put more wood on his fire so the light would carry, and waited for us to climb to him through the thing that was killing us. To this day, I don't know if that was cruelty or kindness, or simply a man letting other men arrive at their own reckoning in their own time. Maybe it was all 3. The deepest things usually are. The granddaughter was behind him, in the warm dark, watching with her quick black eyes, and her face still hadn't changed in 3 years, and it didn't change now. Salomon started talking. The words came out of him in clouds, his learned scraps of the language, halting and wrong-footed, and I couldn't follow them, but I could follow the shape of what he was doing. He was telling the man about the Hoggins, about the bed and the 4 of them and the blankets that hadn't been enough. He was telling him about the children in my cabin. He was, in his soft, cheating town way, doing the bravest thing I ever saw him do, which was to stand in a freezing doorway and ask, on behalf of men who'd never earned it, for everything. The man let him finish. Then he looked past Salomon, past me, and he looked at Carl Prout sagging between us, half-conscious, his eyes rolling, and something moved across his face that I have never been able to name. Not triumph. I'd braced for triumph, and I think I'd even have understood it, would have thought it fair. It wasn't that. It was closer to sorrow. As if the sight of the loudest of us brought low gave him no pleasure at all, only confirmed something tired he'd known about people for a long time and had hoped, against his own better sense, to be wrong about. He said something to Salomon, 2 words, maybe 3. Salomon's frozen face went slack. He said them again, asking, "Are you sure? Is that what you mean?" And the man said them once more, the same flat way, and would not say anything else. I had to grab Salomon's arm. What did he say? Salomon turned to me, and the firelight was on his face, and there were ice crystals on his lashes, and his voice when it came was very small. "He says," Salomon said, "that the hill is warm, that there is room." He swallowed, and it looked like it hurt. "But not for all of us. He says the room holds what it holds. He says we choose who comes up the hill, and he watches us choose." I didn't understand at first. I thought I'd misheard, or Salomon had. We choose. It was his hill, his hole, his mercy. Surely the choosing was his. But the man sat there beyond the fire with his terrible patient sorrow, and I understood slowly, the way the cold had taught me to understand things that winter, all at once and forever. He was not going to be the one to decide who lived. He had room for some and not all, and he could have made the cut himself, played God in his doorway, and no one in that valley would ever have had standing to say a word against him. But he wouldn't. He was handing the knife back to us. "You sort your people," he was saying, without saying it. "You who came up here certain of your own goodness, who laughed and named and planned and waited politely to rob me. You stand in the warm light I dug with my own hands, and you tell me which of your children and your old women and your loud, cruel men get to live. And I will sit here, and I will watch your faces while you do it, and that will be the only justice I take." It was the most merciless mercy I have ever encountered. It was also, I have come to believe, the only honest one. Because we had been God in that valley, all of us, every day in the small way, deciding without ever saying so that some lives were worth laughing at and some weren't, that some people were Mountain Joe and some were neighbors, sorting the world into the ones who mattered and the ones who could be made small. He was only making us do out loud, in the cold, with the lives in front of us, the thing we'd been doing in comfort all along. He was making us feel the weight of the sorting we'd always done for free. I stood in that orange light, and the arithmetic came up in me again. But it was a different arithmetic now, a kind no man should ever have to work. The room holds what it holds. How many? He hadn't said. He wouldn't say. We'd have to bring them up the hill and find out where the warmth ran short and whoever was past that line. Carl chose first. Carl, who could barely stand, who I'd half carried 2 miles, lifted his rolling head and got out in a voice like gravel the first clear words he'd managed since he fell. "The girls, the children, all the children first." And then lower, so low I almost missed it, the thing that I think saved whatever was left of Carl Prout's soul. "Not me. Take me last. I'm the one said his name." The man on the hill heard that. I saw him hear it. Salomon hadn't even translated it yet, and the man's eyes moved to Carl and held there, and something in that long, flat sorrow on his face shifted, not softened exactly, but registered, the way the surface of deep water registers a stone dropped in from very high up. A widening ring, a small disturbance that goes all the way down. He spoke again. Just to Salomon, just a few words, and Salomon let out a breath that turned to fog and broke. "What?" I said. "What now?" "He says," Salomon said, and there was something new in his voice, something I'd call hope if hope hadn't seemed like such a foolish word to use in that place. "He says, bring them. Bring them all. Start now. He says." Salomon stopped. He pressed the back of his wool-wrapped hand to his mouth. "He says he will see how much the hill will hold for people who have learned to put their children first. He says maybe the hill holds more than he thought. He says go fast." I didn't understand the change. I don't fully understand it now. I think, And this is just an old man guessing at another man's heart across 40 years and a gulf I was never meant to cross. I think he had set us a test he expected us to fail. I think he had braced himself to watch proud men shove each other aside in his doorway, to watch us prove, one last time, exactly what he'd always known we were. And the first thing the loudest of us had said was, "Take me last." And it had cost him something to be wrong about us. You could see it cost him. It is a hard thing to have hated people the right amount for a long time and then have one of them, at the worst moment, do the one decent thing you'd stopped expecting. It takes away the clean shape of your anger. It makes the world complicated again, right when complication is the last thing a tired heart wants. But he chose it anyway. He chose to be made complicated. He chose, sitting in the only warmth for 2 miles in any direction, to gamble it on the chance that we might be a little better than we'd ever shown him. We turned to go back down for the others, and that was when we heard it. Far off, thin, carried up the frozen hill on air so still it might as well have been glass. The Prout girl screaming again. But different now, not the fierce scream that had woken me. Worse. The sound a child makes over a person and not over the dark, and I felt Carl go rigid between us, felt the last of his strength flood back into him all at once on a tide of pure terror, and he tore loose of our shoulders and started down that hill toward his cabin and his family, and whatever had made his daughter make that sound. Running, falling, getting up, running into the killing dark, 2 miles away, with the cold reaching for him every step. And we went after him. And the man on the hill stood up at last in his doorway, the firelight all around him, and watched us go. That's what the screaming was. By the time Carl reached his cabin and threw the frozen door back in Salaman, and I came stumbling in behind him, half dead ourselves, it was already over. Marta's mother, the one who couldn't be moved, the one we'd all silently written out of the arithmetic before we ever left, had slipped away near the stove while we were gone, quiet, the way the very old sometimes go when they've decided not to be a weight on the ones they love. The little Prout girl had been sitting with her, holding her hand the way a child does, and had felt the hand go cool and then cold, and had understood, in the way children understand the unspeakable all at once, that something had happened that could not be made to unhappen. And she had screamed, not from fear of the dark this time, from the first grief of her short life. I have thought about the timing of it for 40 years, that the old woman died in the very hour we were up on the hill, learning that the man would let us live, that the one person we'd already given up on was taken from us before we could even try to be better than the giving up. There's a cruelty in that arithmetic that I have never been able to balance. We went up the hill and won mercy for everyone, and came down to find that everyone was already one less. Marta knelt by her mother and did not scream, and did not weep, not then. She just smoothed the old woman's hair back from her forehead with one hand, over and over, the way you'd settle a child to sleep, and she said something low in a language her mother had spoken and she half remembered, and Carl stood over the both of them with his frozen wrappings still on his torn hands, and his face came apart in a way I have only seen a few times in my life and hope never to see again. And then, because the cold does not stop for grief, the cold has never once in the history of the world stopped for grief, I had to be the one to say it. "We have to go now," I said, "all of us, while we still can. He's holding the hill open." I hated myself for the words even as they left me. To stand in a room where a woman had just died and say we have to leave her and walk through the dark to be saved. But that is what survival is, most of the time. It isn't the grand thing the stories make it. It's a man with no feeling left in his face saying the unbearable practical thing in the worst possible moment. Because if he doesn't, there'll be more of them, more cooling hands, more children learning grief by the dying stove. We went up the hill in the last black hours before dawn, all of us that were left, carrying the children, half carrying each other. I won't take you step by step through it again. You've walked that cold with me once already, and once is enough for any soul. I'll only tell you that we made it, every one of us still living, and that the man was in his doorway when we came, and the orange light was on the snow, and his granddaughter stood beside him now instead of behind him. That was the thing I noticed. The girl had come up out of the warm dark to stand in the doorway in the cold, beside her grandfather, watching us climb. And as we came into the light, hauling our children and our frostbitten old men and our grief, her face changed. 3 years it hadn't changed. Not once through all our laughing. And now, watching a column of the people who'd made her grandfather small come crawling up the hill carrying their bobbies, broken and humbled and alive, something moved in that closed-door face and it cracked open, and I saw what had been behind it the whole time. It wasn't contempt. I'd always read it as contempt. It was waiting. She had been waiting all those years to find out whether we were worth her grandfather's mercy. And I think in that moment, watching Carl Prout carry another man's child up a frozen hill, she decided that maybe we were. Not certainly. Just maybe. And maybe was more than we deserved and more than she'd expected, and it was enough to crack her face. The hill held us. All of us. I will tell you plainly that I don't know how, and I came to believe that the man himself didn't entirely know how either, that when he'd said the room holds what it holds, he had honestly not known the answer, and had found out only as we filled his warm, dark room with our bodies and our breath and our living heat, packed shoulder to shoulder in the earth, that a thing built right and built patient holds more than its maker ever dared to promise. We crowded into that room that everyone had laughed at, that I myself had called a grave, and the warmth of the hill came up around us slow and even in breathing, the heat of 1,000 small fires given back, and the children stopped shaking, and the old men's faces lost the gray, and somewhere in the dark a baby that I'd been sure was dying began instead to cry. A good sound. A furious, healthy, living sound. We lived in that hill for 9 days, while the great cold stood on the world and would not move. I won't pretend it was a fellowship those 9 days. It was cramped and it stank and there were quarrels, and the grief came out in people sideways and ugly the way grief does. But we lived, and the man moved among us in the warm dark, quiet, tending his clever fire, and the granddaughter passed water and what food there was, and slowly, so slowly I almost missed it happening, the Mountain Joe stopped. I heard Salomon ask him his name. His real name, and I heard the man say it, slow and patient as he'd said it to me 3 years before. And this time, packed in the dark of the hill he'd dug, with my children alive because of him, I held on to it. I made my mouth learn it. I will not write it here because it was given in trust and it is not mine to scatter on a page. But I learned it. After 3 years of refusing, when it cost me nothing and would have been easy, I learned it when it was hard, in the dark, owing him everything. On the 10th day the cold finally broke. You could feel it go. The air changed in the throat of the passage, lost its edge, and a man stuck his head out and called back that there was weather coming, real weather, gray clouds and a softer wind, and we crawled out one by one into a world that was still frozen solid but was, for the first time in 2 weeks, no longer actively trying to kill us. The sun had warmth in it again. Thin, but there. I stood on that ugly red hillside blinking in the light, the way I'd once seen him stand and blink, and I understood at last what those eyes of his had been. Not the eyes of a man who'd been proven right, but the eyes of a man who had hoped, against everything, that being right wouldn't have to cost so many people so much. Here is the ending, and it is not the one I wanted to write. The man on the hill died that spring. Not of the cold. The cold he'd beaten it for all of us. He'd beaten it so thoroughly that 30-some people walked down off his hill alive who would otherwise have frozen in their proud square houses. He died in April, of nothing dramatic, of a sickness in the chest that the 9 days of cramped foul air in the hill had likely planted, and that an old man's body couldn't shake. He died saving us, and then he died of the saving, slow, 2 months later, and there is an irony in that I have never been able to laugh at and never been able to set down. We buried him on his own hill above the doorway facing the morning. The whole valley came, every soul he'd warmed, and a good many he hadn't, the ones who'd only heard. The Apache came down too, more of them than I'd known were anywhere near, and they stood a little apart and sang something low that went on a long time, and we stood with our hats in our frozen then thawed hands and did not understand the words and understood completely the thing underneath the words. The granddaughter stood at the grave with her closed-door face, and when it was done she walked back into the hill, into the warm dark, and did not come out while we were there. She stayed on. She kept the spring and the hill, and as far as I know she kept them the rest of her life, and not one person in that valley ever again so much as breathed a word about taking that sweet water off the people who lived in the hill. We'd learned. It is a poor thing to learn a man's worth only by surviving on it. But it is better than not learning it at all. I have his name in me still. I am an old man now, and most of what I knew has leaked out of me the way the Count leaks out when I'm tired, but his name has stayed, and I say it sometimes, alone, out loud, just to keep it real. I have Elsa's brass button, too, in my left pocket, worn nearly smooth, and on the nights when the cold comes and my breath shows over my bed and the old fear sits down on my chest, I roll it between my fingers and I count, not fence posts now, not cat. I count the faces in that warm dark, 31 of them. I have counted them 10,000 times, and it always comes to 31, and the 31 are alive because a man we ruined for sport dug a hole in a hill we'd laughed at, and then opened it to us on the worst night of our lives, and asked us, before he did, to look honestly at what we were and choose. I told you at the start that a hole in the earth can mean a grave or it can mean a home, and that most of us never learn the difference until the cold comes to teach it. I learned it, we all did. We learned it the most expensive way there is. And every winter since, when the first real cold rolls down out of the north and I see my own breath hang in the air, I think of him sitting patient in his doorway, building up his fire so the light would reach us, watching us climb. I think of how he chose to be made complicated. I think there is no harder or finer thing a person can do than to be wronged, and then be needed, and then choose, knowing exactly what we were, to open the door anyway. I don't know what the girl saw in our faces that last night that made her decide we might be worth it. I have spent 40 years hopping she was right. Some nights I am not sure,